The right side of the EDRM is really about processing, it's about analysis. It's really about the phases where data has been transferred from the forensics folks to the forensic accountants, to the lawyers, to the people who are actually doing the review, and really focuses on kind of the meat of the case itself. Once the data has been received from the initial collection, the data has to be processed, and we'll get into that in a moment. There has to be some level of analysis, and then there's a review of that information to extract the relevant documents. You're also at that point pulling out privilege information as well as preparing information in a way that makes sense. This process is often very iterative to collect, to process, to run keywords, to sample the information in a way that really reduces the overall burden of the cost and burden of the collection itself. Processing is very simple. Processing is taking all the different sources that have existed and combining them together into a central database. If you have a Word document, you have an email, you have a text message, all of that contains content. All of that has a body of text, all of that has a header. Processing is really the extraction of that information. It's combining all of that data into a database, extracting the information so that you can then run searches, you can cull the information. The processing is really the aggregation of all that information into a unified database so that people can then work with that information in a way that is useful and is proper. Metadata is the data about the data. As you are processing the information, one of the things that we do is extract the content. And from that content extraction, we're able to pull back metadata. And so what we're talking about there is file save information, we're talking about created date and time, we're talking about last access date and time. All that information is stored within the file themselves. In Word documents, for example, you also have when the document was last printed. In other files, you may have other metadata data points that you're able to extract. All that really sets the stage, sets the scene of who accessed the document, when it was modified, how the file was accessed itself. And so all that information is very useful to be able to set time and date, to be able to prove ownership of files, and to ensure that a file hasn't changed. And so as a case goes on, it's really important to look at that data and try to figure out who did what and when did they do it. And so the way you're going to do that is during the processing phase by making an analysis of the metadata itself. And so it's important to preserve the metadata during the collection process so that when you get to this phase that you're able to extract that information and it stayed the same as it was before. As we mentioned, if you were to simply drag and drop a file, you're changing the created date and time. Well, now when you're actually in the processing phase, you're able to see that the created date could be 2 years after the actual file was modified. And so this is really where that comes back into play, to be able to say, oh, I see it. The problem is, once that metadata has been changed, there's very little you can do to change it back. And so it's important to be able to preserve the information in a way that makes sense, so that when you get to processing, you're able to work with the actual file themselves and don't have to go back and recollect it, don't have to go back and re-preserve that information again. Because when you get to this point, you're really incurring a high dollar cost value of the process where you're actually going to be going through and processing and extracting that information. In general, there's two types of metadata. There's system level metadata and there's application metadata. The big difference is, as we mentioned, the system metadata is where the file was stored externally, and it's used to really track where a file was located. The application metadata is actually the file within the file that really talks about how a file was utilized. The difference being the created date and time is really the system metadata, when the file was printed, when the file was last accessed. That information is the application level metadata. The most common steps during processing is to capture the information, collect it into a database. First, you will inventory the files, where we're literally going to figure out what you have and what you don't have, and then you can go back and try to figure out what's missing. We uncompress all the zip files, tar files, jar files, any compound file. That information is extracted. You'll do an analysis of the signature of the file. The signature of the file is basically the stamp of the file to say what kind of file it is. For example, it's a PDF or it's a Word document, it's another type of file. The signature is if it matches the file opens up. But if you notice, there are actually files that you can change the file extension and then still open that file in the proper application. That's because the signature of the file is not necessarily tied to the file extension. But there are applications that will allow you to detect that a signature of a file has been changed. That may be insignificant, but it may also prove that somebody is trying to hide information within data. And so by going through and doing a signature analysis, you're able to see what information is there and what information may have been changed, whether unintentionally or intentionally. Part of the process of processing is also removing of operating system files. This is generally referred to as denisting. The reason for that is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They store hash values of files. Companies like Microsoft, Apple, Adobe will give the National Institute of Standards and Technology copies of their applications. They will then run analyses and will make hash values, which is basically a thumbprint of the file, and then will actually publish those lists. And when you're going through and you're capturing information from a computer, you're able to compare the files against the original set of documents and the original operating system files. And if everything matches to what was on the NIST list, you can automatically exclude that information. You can automatically exclude those and never have to even look at them. And so by having that information, you're able to eliminate a large swath of files right off the bat, because obviously there's many, many files that come in an operating system, that come in applications. If anything's been changed, if a user deliberately tried to hide information within a file that was on the NIST list, for example, the metadata itself, the hash value of the files, will be changed. And so those will be key to be able to identify files that don't match, that were part of the original NIST list, but now have a signature change, have a file hash value change. And so you're able to identify those files often even faster by being able to compare those files against the NIST list files. Then we also cull the data. You cull the data based on file type, based on file time and date. You'll often cull files based on custodian, and you're ultimately, what you're doing there is reducing the volume of unnecessary data out of the case so that you have the ability to really focus on the key documents that you need. You'll identify duplicate files. You'll want to obviously make sure that you remove them. When you get down to review, it's important to be looking at the fewest number of documents that you have. And so by eliminating duplicates, it reduces just simply more data that people have to look at. Again, we're going to extract file content. We're going to extract the metadata. What that allows you to do is run searches against that information. We're going to convert all of the files from all the different sources, the text messages, the Word docs, the Excel files, for example. We're going to convert them into a unified format so that now you can be able to view them using a standard viewer. Oftentimes when you have complex CAD drawings or architectural files, they're very complicated, they're very neat, they're super cool, but they are very difficult to view using standard viewers. And so having the ability to convert those into a format that really works with everything else is very key, because then it allows those to be viewable by people who may not have the actual application. Oftentimes the person doing the review is a lawyer, or they're an accountant or what have you. They're obviously not going to have the specialized software that you need to look at architectural drawings. And so by converting those into a universal format, you're basically making it being viewable by folks who are outside of that industry or do not have the specialized software required to view those files, which makes that data more useful. You're also doing quality control. You're going through and fixing file errors. You're identifying the files may be password protected or information was not able to be extracted from a file for whatever reason. And then you're just dealing with the exceptions. Oftentimes it can be as simple as going back to the client and asking for passwords and trying to open those files. But there could be files that you can't open. And that's okay as long as you document that part of the process. It's imperative to make a note of what you were able to extract as well as what you were able to not extract. Once you have all of the data and you have a universe of information, it's important to cull the information down so you get to the relevant information that you actually need. You oftentimes will eliminate custodians. It's best to over-collect the number of custodians you need initially because you might not know, but when you get to review, it's important to identify the key folks. You want to look at the CEO and the CFO. Maybe you don't need to look at the head of accountant. Maybe you start to look at the head of accounting and then that pulls in 3 more folks, for example. By having the ability to decide which users you have and you don't need, you're able to eliminate potential data points. By potentially applying a date filter, if your case runs from 2012 to 2015, you obviously don't need anything from 2011. You don't need anything afterwards. By applying a date filter, you're winnowing the data down to the critical time period for the information that you need. Because all this information is in the database, you have the ability to go back if your date range changes, but for the actual review, initially, you have the proper data that you actually need. Same thing with your keywords. Keywords are a great way to identify information. They're a great way to try to pinpoint the data that you actually are needing to look at. But keywords can be both over-inclusive as well as under-inclusive. And so it's important to make the keyword process an iterative process. You're going to run your keywords. You're going to look at the information that you get. You're going to see what information you're missing, and then maybe run new keywords. You're going to look at that information and try to figure out if you're getting what you need. If you have a case where people are very good about hiding the information, you may need to come up with keywords that really pull information that you may not be thinking of. You may not be working in the industry which the people themselves are, and so you need to run keywords that actually make sense for the data itself. And so it's important to run the keywords, look at your hit reports, see what you have, see what you're missing, and then to do it again. Oftentimes at that point, you will output the data to a review platform where somebody will actually look at the documents themselves. That may be when people then refine the keywords and then load that information back in, extract it again, give another set. Oftentimes that goes into a database. Then at that point in time, people are doing the review. They're looking at the documents, they're deciding, is this responsive to the case, is this non-responsive? Maybe they're doing issue coding, deciding if it's related to issue 1, 2, 3, or 4. And what have you, and then maybe they're stopping. That typically is not usually the end. Oftentimes people then do a privilege review where they will look for communications to or from lawyers. Simply having a lawyer on a document, though, does not necessarily make it privileged. It's important to figure out if they're actually providing legal advice or strategy related to the case. That information is privileged. The federal rules really ensure that you're only supposed to be producing non-privileged information, and so it's important to really take that process very seriously to make sure that nothing slips through. And then ultimately the final output is delivered. After the responsive information is identified, the privileged information is removed, your final output is the delivery to the court. It could be the delivery to the opposing side. It could be the delivery to the subject matter expert. One of the things to realize is that data is growing very quickly, and the content of data is really expanding very, very quickly. People are storing information for a very long time, and it's important to reduce the data down to the actual data you need so that you're not looking at everything. If you don't, it could spend a lot of money on review. You could spend a lot of money on folks who are doing the analysis, and they could be looking at completely and totally irrelevant information. So if you take a lot of time to really put together a culling process that is both sound as well as done right, you can really winnow the data down to the smallest possible population without fear of missing information. And if you do this right, you can get to the information you need very quickly using very key technology. And that's really important. Nowadays, most people have a thumb drive. Thumb drives are growing in size every day. If you have a 64 gig thumb drive and it's full completely to the brim, and you were to print all of those documents, that's the equivalent of 17 football fields full of paper And that's obviously a lot of documents. If ultimately you're trying to get to the key documents in your case, you want to identify those however you can. You want to try to cull the information down, because if you had to go through 17 football fields full of information, it would literally take you forever, and you'd never be able to actually find the information that you need. So by applying proper culling techniques and by applying proper search terms, you're able to identify that information in a way that really makes sense and really focuses you in on the data that you need very quickly.